Welcome, everyone. I'm Michaela Doyle with the Kellogg School of Management. Thank you for joining us today for our series, This is Kellogg, Kellogg's Ad Tech Research Lab, Predictive Incrementality by Experimentation with Professor Florian Zettelmeyer. The virtual This is Kellogg series showcases Kellogg thought leadership and initiatives important to the future of the school. You can catch up on prior webinars in this series at our virtual events page on the Kellogg alumni website. We will put a link into the site for that chat now. Today's presentation will last 1 hour, and we encourage you to submit questions for Professor Zettelmeyer anytime using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and we will incorporate audience questions into the discussion as time permits. I'm now pleased to introduce Florian Zettelmeyer. He founded and directs the program on data analytics at Kellogg, the school's analytics and AI initiative. In recent years, he's focused on the ad tech industry, in particular on how to improve advertising measurements. In addition to being a chaired professor at Kellogg, Professor Zettelmeyer is a senior science leader at Amazon, and he leads the Advertising Economics Organization. Welcome, Florian. Thank you for speaking with us today.
Thank you so much, Michaela. I really appreciate the introduction, and welcome to everybody who is here. It's always a good day when I get to talk to our Kellogg community and our Kellogg alumni in particular. So I wanted to give you just a little bit of context of where this is coming from. So I will talk to you today about Kellogg's Ad Tech Research Lab, which is a new initiative that I created starting in September of 2023, and that has been really, really successful and has, I think, created a lot of buzz among the faculty and also outside in the research community. And to give you a little bit of a background as to where this came from, the following happened, which is about 4 years ago, a little under 4 years ago, towards the beginning of the pandemic, I got a call from somebody who I had known for a long time, who was very high up at Amazon, who said, "Would you like to build up our advertising economics organization?" And it was the pandemic, and Zoom teaching was not the most fun thing to do. And I said, "Well, why not? Let me try and see if I can get like an outside perspective and break out of my usual life as a faculty member and do something that makes me a little bit uncomfortable." And so I did, and I took a 2-year leave of absence. I went to Amazon and I started building a team up from roughly 3 people when I joined to about 30 people. And it was an amazing experience. I hadn't really managed anybody up to that point in my life, right? Which to a lot of you is probably a laughable statement, but if you think about it being a faculty member, that's how life is. And I had a lot of fun. I learned a lot. And when I came back to Kellogg, I had sort of 2 important thoughts. The first thought that I had is, how could I still keep some leg involved directly with industry or Amazon? And so that's why I ended up finding an arrangement with both the company as well as with Kellogg, that I could still remain in a partial role at Amazon, and I still do that. And then the other thing that I thought immediately about was, what is it that I could take back from what I learned about what really was running a research lab in a corporation, at a very high-performing corporation where there's a ton of science. And what is it that I could learn about best practices that are useful for a university setting? So could I create some cross-fertilization? And the result of that is that I ended up pitching the dean and then the provost of the university this idea of building an ad tech research lab. And that's what I've done over the last year. And that's what I wanted to share with you today. And it's been just a ton of fun. Let me also just say one thing, which most of people in the corporate sector will completely understand. Obviously, today, I'm in no way, shape, or form talking for Amazon. I'm only talking in my role as a faculty member here at Kellogg. And so let me get started. And I'm really excited to share with you some of the things we've done. All right. So what is this thing? We call it the Ad Tech Research Lab, or short Ad Lab. You noticed I have been trying to be clever by writing Ad Lab with a little T in the middle for Ad Tech Research Lab, Ad Lab. And so the Ad Lab consists of 13 faculty members that we call faculty fellows. And what's kind of unusual about the way the lab operates is that it really is extremely diverse. So we have everybody from full professors to assistant professors. We have a mixture of people who are more statistically and oriented that we call quant people in our world, who are trained as economists or statisticians. But we also have people who are trained in psychology, who we call behavioral. So we sort of run the full gamut. And then the other thing that's really fun about it is, we have this distinction at the school between what we call tenure track faculty member, who are primarily research faculty, and who get evaluated in addition to their teaching and service for their research, and also faculty who we call clinical, which are full-time teaching faculty who often have a very distinguished background from industry. And so the lab consists of 13 people, or we have this motley collection of very different people. And so you might think sort of what's the point of this? And so the point of this lab is actually very simple, which is that the point is to simply reassert and cement our excellence in marketing. And you probably know a little bit about the evolution of Kellogg marketing, which is that in the 1970s and 1980s, the marketing department, in particular people like Phil Kotler and Lou Stern and Brian Sternthal and other sort of luminaries of the marketing field, they turned marketing from what had been sort of a somewhat chaotic, intuitive discipline into a very recognized, very practical, very disciplined discipline. And it totally put Kellogg on the map. It's one of the things that made us as a school rise in the famous business school rankings that got started at that time and got the top spot. It's the reason why even today, when we are ranked in any ranking, basically we're heads and shoulders above everybody else when it comes to marketing in the reputation of people on the outside. Now, what has happened, however, in the meantime, is that marketing practice, which I think in some sense was a fairly timeless discipline for a long time, has morphed into something that's very different today. And you all know this, which is that it's now a predominantly very digital oriented field. It's highly technical in the sense that it has a lot of data science, a lot of methods, there's a lot of automation in it, et cetera. It's highly algorithmic, and it's driven relentlessly by data and by evidence and feedback cycles. And one of the interesting things that has come with that is that when we started out when we put Kellogg on the map on marketing in our department in the 70s and 80s, a lot of the innovation was actually coming out of business schools and a lot of the thought leadership. And the truth of the matter is that today there's such enormous returns associated with marketing that you have a lot of innovation and investment from practice that happens in this area. And so what we want to do is that we want to essentially double down on marketing and our excellence in marketing by cementing really our Kellogg leadership position in marketing as the leading think tank on digital advertising and digital marketing. Okay, so that's kind of the basic idea. Now, let me show you what kind of the questions are that we're trying to work on. So what we're currently working on are a bunch of a lot of different research areas, but I just wanted to give you a sense for what these are. So first of all, advertising measurement. So for example, we have a number of people working on extremely innovative approaches to the question of how do we measure causal advertising effects at scale, which is a huge problem in practice in the industry. We have work streams on auction design. How should a demand-side platform optimally set fees for access to third-party ad exchanges? You already noticed these are incredibly difficult questions that lend themselves very well to academic inquiry. Experimentation techniques. How do we measure causality when there's parallel experimentation? Ad creation. Can we design effective streaming video ads at lower cost than traditional TV ads? Budget optimization. How should we validate marketing mix models for budget allocation? We work on issues of privacy and regulation. For example, what are the performance and welfare implications of restricting data usage for ad optimization? You might be aware of the fact that there have been massive changes that are going on in the industry right now about being able to identify who customers are and what they do. And this has wide-ranging implications for the way that all of marketing is performed. And we're right in the middle of that discussion. ad personalization. How do we use generative AI to personal ads to consumers? So those are the kinds of questions we're working on. Every single one of these, we have actually work streams running. So the best way to think about what the lab is, other than a collection of 13 people, is that the lab provides a couple of really key benefits to faculty who are participating on it. And the first one is that we are moving. So you may not be aware of this, but we have a model where traditionally in some of parts of the university, there is very much of a team science approach that arises from the fact that you have large equipment expenditures that you need to share. So if you're a chemistry professor, you have a lab of 20 or 30 people because you have a $5 million piece of equipment that needs to be shared and coordinated among people. That is not the norm at the social sciences and also at the business school. And what we are doing is we are bringing that team science approach to Kellogg. I have, in my experience at Amazon, learned that a lot of science is done really well in teams, and that's one of the things that we're trying to do here in the Ad Lab. So we work as a team to discuss research and learn from industry. It breaks down barriers to communication, improves research, creates a sense of community. It's been really fun to do that. The other thing that is really a big deal about the lab is that we have implemented a series of mechanisms that we have invented about ensuring that there's ongoing and high quality feedback that arises for people who are working in it. And it is leading to big accelerations of the peer reviewed feedback cycle for junior faculty, which is something that makes our faculty more successful and more likely to get published and more likely to actually have a successful career and produce more high impact research. The lab leads to knowledge sharing from advertising institutions. In addition to industry connections that a lot of us have because we are fairly senior in the industry, we help our members with data acquisition and problem framing and introduction to industry insiders in a very systematic way, which particularly for junior faculty is sometimes hard to get. We also provide resources. Participating in the Ad Lab increases your productivity because of the fact that we are in the process of trying to ramp up the help of postdoc staff, researchers, et cetera, that can help faculty members make headway towards research. So what's the impact of all of this? The result of all of this is that the Ad Lab leads us to bigger ideas because we're working in teams on them, to more research impact, to more impact for practice than faculty can achieve individually. And also because of the fact that you get constantly exposed to what's currently going on in a very fast-moving industry to improve our teaching. Because frankly, it is sort of inevitable that you hear about all of the new stuff that's currently going on and that makes itself back into the classroom. Okay, so how do we do this? The way we do this is through a series of mechanisms. And so this is a term that I learned actually being at Amazon, which is very big on mechanisms. You should think of it as processes. And so what we do is we've sort of instituted a series of processes that have been very successful. The first one is we've done something that we've ported from industry that frankly doesn't exist in academia. And you're going to laugh about it because it seems so obvious. But we do weekly stand-up meetings as a lab, where we simply go around and we ask people what's been going on in your work life in the last week. And, we have everything from my paper got a revision and I will be asking for feedback to I learned something really interesting at the CMO conference, or I ran into a problem getting a company to give me data. Do you have any advice for me? What can you do for me? So we can celebrate successes. We can help people. We get people to connect. People sometimes say, I've been thinking about the same problem, let's talk, etc. Again, these are kind of the hallmarks, I think, of a well-performing sort of science community. And I'm really just delighted that I think we've been able to make the community work better with these ideas. All right, the next thing that we do is we do weekly research discussions, which are very in-depth discussions for people. And so what we do is we have adopted a policy of no presentations ever, no slides. And so our faculty members create these in-depth documents that get commented on in real time by other people on Google Docs in a meeting where we sort of follow this famous Amazon doc reading format, which leads to incredible amounts of feedback for our faculty members. and often just amazing ideas. I can't tell you how many situations I've run in over the last year since we've been doing this weekly, where some breakthrough happened because of the fact that you ended up getting a feedback that is not normal in the setting that we're living in, and it's been really great for people. The third one that we have is that we've decided to take a number of slots every quarter and ask very high-level industry leaders to come and share their knowledge with us. And so we've had so far in Neil Richter, who's the head of bidding science for Amazon, Michael Vincent, the chief research officer of Comscore, Claire Wyatt, who is actually a Kellogg a graduate who is building up the Albertsons Media Collective, Steve Baxter from Ovative Group. We've had the chief digital economist for Amazon, Phil Leslie, come in, and we have the VP for research for Meta coming in a few weeks, and then also the person who heads ad measurement for Google. So you get the sense we're basically just trying to get these people in. We're creating collaborations with them, and frankly, we're just having everybody's learning from them and finding out what's going on in the industry. The fourth mechanism is that we have an annual AdLab Faculty Fellows Conference where we get together and talk more in depth about a research area that we're interested in. And then the last one is that we have started ad hoc industry collaborations. We're currently in active discussions with, for example, the Michael Vincent and Claire Wyatt and Steve Baxter about data sharing agreements, and faculty members are working on these for projects that are of joint interest with our industry colleagues. So overall, people have had a lot of fun. There's been a ton of enthusiasm around it. Our next step really is to scale the Ad Lab in terms of hiring, creating more of an external visibility. I noticed that in the Q&A, there was, for example, a question as to whether we're going to share a link about the AdTech Lab website. And the answer is we don't have yet a website. You're getting a sneak preview. What we wanted to do first is we didn't want to build the website and then deliver the actual initiative. We wanted to deliver the initiative and then start thinking about an external perspective. And this is our first foray where we're talking to outsiders about it. So you guys are getting a real sneak peek in what we're doing, and stay tuned. We will have an external presence going up relatively soon. If you want to become involved by helping us either with your knowledge or with interest in potential research collaborations, or because you are enthusiastic and you would like to fund something that would help us grow and scale our ad lab, we will be delighted. And so I've put my email address down here, and also those of that of David Sack, who's our Associate Dean of Alumni Relations and Development as well. So please feel free to reach out to us, and we would love to hear if you are interested in this topic and how we could collaborate and how we could involve you in the work that we do as a school. All right. So that's the kind of 10-minute spiel I wanted to give you on the Ad Lab and share with you this initiative. I'm extremely excited about it. There is nothing like this at any other business school that we know about. And we think that this is going to really, or has already changed the excellence of what we do as a group. What you may not be aware of is that, right, you have this sort of dual confluence of the fact that virtually all marketing is becoming digital, that much of marketing is becoming ad tech. JP Morgan, believe it or not, has just announced a few weeks ago that they are going to go into the ad tech space as well. And all the retailers are going to ad tech, et cetera. And what we're trying to do here is we have a very unusual set of concentration among the faculty that no other school has, where we actually are able to get 13 people, which is a lot, which is sort of roughly half the marketing department, interested and collaborating on ad tech and on digital marketing. And so we have an area of expertise which is super unusual for any business school in the country at the moment. And so we're excited about it. All right, so that's the basis. With that in mind, I thought I would share with you one of the research projects that we're actually working on and that we have done. And so this is a project that I myself have worked on. And we call this project Predicted Incrementality by Experimentation. And this is joint work with my marketing colleague, Brett Gordon, who's also a member of the lab, as well as with a gentleman called Bob Mokler, who works at Meta. So let me give you a sense. One of the things that you may have heard of, if you will know for sure if you are in the advertising space, but you may even have heard of if you're not in the advertising space, is that it is incredibly difficult to measure ad effects. And there is an incredibly famous quote that is, I think it was the most overused quote in marketing, by a guy called John Wanamaker, who was a department store owner in 1908, I think he made the statement. And the quote is that, half of my advertising isn't working. I just don't know which half. And we thought that we could solve this problem when digital advertising came around, because the original thought was that the reason why people had trouble figuring out how well your marketing dollars are working is because we initially, think of typical TV advertising or print advertising. We didn't know who advertising was actually reaching. And then we also didn't know which of the people who the advertising reached actually bought the product. And all of that went away with digital, where we started being able to track individual consumer exposures to actions of people. So we could start seeing whether they had actually purchased, et cetera. And it turns out that despite all of that information, we are in a situation where if you ask most CMOs how well they think that they know their ads are working, you're going to get a pretty depressing result. It turns out to be quite difficult to tell how well your ads are actually working. And the work that Brett and Bob and Robert Mokler and myself are doing is an attempt to try to make some real headway in this. And it's, I think, very successful, and I'm really excited to share it with you. Okay, so let me just quickly explain what we're dealing with here. So it is pretty universally accepted that so-called randomized controlled trials, or sometimes they're referred to as RCTs, are recognized as the gold standard to measure the incremental or causal effects of advertising. And so the basic idea is that you have a target audience you want to reach. And what you basically do is you run like a medical experiment, right? So you do random assignment of a group into what we call a test group and a control group. So the test group is eligible to actually see the ad, and the control group doesn't get to see the ad. And then what we do is we simply compare the conversions in the test and the control group, and that gives us what we call the RCT lift, so the incremental effect of a campaign. So lift is often, the word lift simply says, did the conversions, sales, or whatever you're interested in increase by 10% or 50% or 100% due to the ad. That's the idea. And the key benefit of running an RCT is that the control group that you have allows you to estimate the thing that we normally don't see, namely, what would people have done had they not seen the ad, right? So if you think about this, the fundamental problem you have in measurement is that you can always see the outcome under what you did. So if you run an ad, you see what people did. What sales they had. If you don't run an ad, you see what people's sales were. But the problem is that the incremental or causal effect is defined as the difference between running an ad and what people did under running an ad and not running an ad, meaning what people did under not seeing an ad. And so the problem is that you can only observe one of those two states. The fact that you run the ad precludes you from not running it, and the fact that you didn't run the ad precludes you from running it. And so at the same time. And as a result of this, measurement is very tricky. And so the beauty about a full-scale experiment like an RCT is the fact that you observe both what happened when you do the ad, that's what's in the test group, and what would have happened had you not done the ad, which is what the control group measures. Okay, so that's what we know is the established gold standard for advertising measurement. And by the way, this is not a very controversial statement. The problem is that running RCTs is extremely challenging. And it's very challenging because RCTs are very expensive because you're essentially including opportunity costs. You're including opportunity costs for the advertiser because you have to essentially withhold what you think is a valuable ad from a big fraction of your audience, which is expensive, at least an expectation. And it also is, frankly, an opportunity cost for the platforms like a Google or a Facebook, because you are essentially, you know that this is a customer where this ad would be a good target, but you're purposefully withholding it for them. And you're doing that at yourself at a financial cost. And so as a result of this, it's just difficult to implement these RCTs at scale. And so, in fact, some advertising platforms don't even support RCTs at scale. All right, so that's the idea. So what do we do if you can't write an RCT, right? So I want you to imagine for a second that we don't have an RCT, which is sort of the equivalent to the idea that our control group just goes poof and goes away, okay? So we have the people who are eligible to be exposed. Now, what happens in every single ad, however, is that not everybody actually gets exposed. So we have a target audience, and due to things like maybe you didn't log onto the service on that particular day, or maybe some other advertiser was willing to pay more to show you an ad. So the ad that was targeted at you wasn't actually shown because it was displaced by another ad. So it's quite normal for people who are in a target audience to either be exposed or unexposed. Okay, so that's the idea. So how do we, in an environment where there is some exposure and some not exposure, but everybody is targeted by this ad, some target audience, how do we typically measure how well an ad works? And so there are really two big approaches. The first is what we call proxy metrics. And these proxy metrics is the standard in the industry. The standard way to measure advertising performance is what we call last click or last touch. So the idea is this: you start with an outcome, for example, a purchase. Then what you do is you define what's called an attribution window. So it's just a window of time that you look backwards from the outcome. So consumer made a purchase. Now you just sort of look back, say 7 days is pretty standard, or 14 days. Those are the standard intervals. Let's say 7 days. You look back 7 days and you ask the following. You say, well, what ads did that consumer get exposed to in the prior 7 days? And then what you do is you simply declare that the last ad that they saw within a 7-day window is responsible for the conversion. Or in other words, what we do is we attribute the conversion to that ad. That's the language we use, okay? Attribute the conversion to that ad. Notice that there's a very fundamental issue here, which is that we don't really observe a counterfactual, right? So we don't really observe what would have happened had you not seen an ad. All we see is that you bought, and then we saw a bunch of ad exposures in front of it, or maybe none. And we say, oh, if you saw an ad within the last 7 days and that was the last ad, then that's because of you. Okay. The big problem with this approach is that it's very easy to imagine that you can either over or underestimate the causal effect or incrementality of the ad, right? So for example, one way to overestimate is this. So imagine that a consumer wanted to buy anyway, but they used the ad as a shortcut to get to the product. If that's the case, just because it was already on their mind, if that's the case, the ad didn't really do anything, but the ad was clicked and therefore gets the credit for the sale that actually occurred. So that's how you can overestimate it. The way in which this approach underestimates is that you say, well, I don't know, maybe it was the ad you saw 2 weeks ago that you maybe didn't even click on, but that made an impression on you and you remembered it. And that's why, in fact, you're buying the product today. And that's not counted because of the fact that the attribution window typically is shortish, like 7 days or 14 days. Okay. So in other words, this is a very imperfect approach. It's very easy to come up with stories as to why it's too high or it's too low. And it's very hard to figure out whether it's too high or too low. That's the issue. Okay. Second big approach. So instead of trying a proxy metric that is just reliant on the exposed groups that saw ads, an alternative is that you compare the outcomes between people who saw versus did not see the ad campaign. And this is what we call the exposed unexposed lift. All right, and so this sounds like a great idea, right? Because it sounds like an unexposed group are sort of the control condition, the control conversions. And the exposed one are, so it's a little bit, it feels a little like an experiment, right? Exposed is you see the ad, unexposed, you don't see the ad. But there's a huge problem here, which is that whether you are exposed or not is no longer driven by random assignment. And the reason that is a huge problem is because we have a ton of evidence that because of the fact that all ad platforms do algorithmic targeting, there is huge amount of what we call selection into exposure versus unexposure. In other words, what virtually every advertising provider does is they run models that target ads to people who are more likely to buy. Why? Because advertisers would like to get their ads in front of people who are in the target market. And as a result of that, there are lots of algorithmic models that essentially try to figure out how likely people are to buy. But what that means is that the people who are exposed are probably more likely to buy in the first place, and the people who are unexposed are probably less likely to buy in the first place. And so what this means is that if you compare how many people buy in the exposed and unexposed group, you're really comparing people who are probably already pretty interested in buying to people who are already not so interested in buying. And that creates a bias in the estimate. In particular, it exaggerates typically how well ads actually work. Okay, and that's a problem, obviously, for an advertiser. And so what my colleague Brett Gordon and I did in prior work that we published one paper, I think, 5 years ago, and another paper 3 years ago, is we did a lot of work trying to figure out whether we could use very heavy-duty data science approaches, what are called causal inference approaches, in order to solve this problem, right? So the idea was to say, okay, we know the exposed and unexposed people are different from each other, but maybe we can, because we know a lot about them, maybe we can find a subset of the two groups that are actually very similar to each other, and that looks kind of like an experiment, and maybe we can use that in order to learn the lift. And so we tried all of this approach, and it was a disaster. Okay, so we used Facebook data to be able to do this. We threw everything that we knew as data scientists and economists at this problem. And in the first study, we did 15 hand-picked studies, and we couldn't come close to replicating the experimental results. And then we reran this thing 2 years ago in a marketing science paper where we ended up having like 1,673 RCTs, so huge amount of experimental studies. We picked the best and the brightest of the models that exist in the world, including deep learning networks, which is the stuff that powers today LLMs, et cetera. We had massive amounts of data, and it was equally depressing. We just couldn't use these data science methods to basically replicate RCTs. So these papers were very depressing because we were basically saying, hey, whatever you're doing that's not running an experiment doesn't really work very well. So, which is just not very helpful in practice because you still have to decide what to do with your ads. And so what should advertisers do? In other words, the problem was that advertisers don't really have the data to run the models that we ask them to do. And even then, it's very hard to make them work. And they can't run these RCTs all the time. So what do we do? And that's what I wanted to show you now, because we're really excited about showing you an approach that we came up with that does remarkably well. So here's the idea. We often actually have RCTs, but we just don't have them for everything. We have some RCTs. Maybe we have one. Maybe we have 10. Maybe we have 1,000, but we typically don't have millions of them. Okay, so imagine we have RCTs for a subset of advertising campaigns, and as a result of that, we can use this to figure out the RCT lift. The problem is that we have all these other campaigns that we didn't run as RCTs, and the question is, how do we determine the RCT lift for those campaigns? Okay, so here is the core idea. The core idea of predicting incrementality by experimentation is that what we're going to do is we're going to use the RCTs for the campaigns that we do know about, and we're going to use them using a sophisticated predictive model that we call PI, predicting incrementality by experimentation, in order to estimate or predict the RCT lift for campaigns that we couldn't run as experiments. So that's the core idea. Okay, so let me try to make the nugget of the idea very concrete. I'm going to start with the simplest possible intuition I can, okay? So imagine the following, which is that I decide to write a model down that basically says my RCT lift is equal to some conversion factor, CF, times my last click conversion. So let me give you an example. So imagine this. I say I've run an experiment for literally just one experiment, okay? And in that experiment, I found that there were 1,000 customers who were incremental. So the difference between test and control group were 1,000 customers. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to look at my test group, which is the one for which I always have data, even if I didn't run an RCT. And I'm going to say, all right, how many conversions did I get when I use one of these proxy metrics, last 7-day last click conversions? And let's say that the last click conversion metric, that normally is the only thing you have, says, 2,000 conversions is where last click conversions. Well, one thing I could do, which is really simple, is I can simply say, well, that sounds like I should take my last click conversions, multiply them by 0.5. And so that's a calibration factor I could use in order to figure out how many conversions are truly incremental. Okay. So that's the basic idea. To apply this, you would basically take this calibration factor and apply it to future non-RCT ad campaigns. Okay. So that's the core idea. So my guess is that some of you actually do something like this. And so hopefully the intuition is clear. Now, the problem is we don't yet know if this prediction is going to be any good, in particular because we're just using one experiment. So can we do better somehow? And yes, we can do better. And so the first thing that we can do is we can actually run such a calibration factor, not just on one experiment, but we can run it on 10, 20, 50, 100, 200 experiments, okay? And so we can calculate an overall average calibration factor, and then hopefully with more data, the calibration factor is going to be more helpful, okay? So what would this look like? And so we actually did this, and I wanted to show you for Facebook data what this looked like. So we ran 2,200 RCTs at Meta. We estimated these calibration factors by outcome type and attribution window. And so let me start with lower funnel online purchases. So these are actual purchases. And then later on, I'm going to show you about upper funnel results like landing pages. So a value of 1 would mean that on average, the number of last click conversions is actually a good predictor of the number of RCT incremental conversions. Okay. So let me start with a very simple model where we are going to use a 1-hour attribution window, super short window. So it says we only give you credit if you clicked on the ad within 1 hour of buying the product. Okay. And so what we actually find is that last click underestimates the number of incremental conversions. So what that means is that the value of 1.25 implies that you need to scale up last click number by 25%. Okay. And it makes sense. 1 hour is a very short window. All right, so intuitively, if you expand the window, we should start capturing some of the slower conversions, and that's exactly what happens. When we look at a one-day attribution window, now slightly we overestimate the effect a little bit. So the value is about 0.9. So we need to take the one-day last click metric and cut it down by 10% to get at the actual incremental effect, right? Makes sense. Longer window, you need to pick up, you're picking up more non-incremental conversions. Let's expand it more. If you go to 7 and 28 days, for example, for 28 days, about 2/3 of the attributed conversions are actually non-incremental, okay? So they would have happened anyway, even without the ad campaign. You get the idea. So we can also do this for mid-funnel and upper funnel, where we find that the difference is much less between different windows. So the bottom line is this. The bottom line is that this kind of proxy metric, last click, is definitely correlated with RCT incrementality, but it needs to be scaled. And the scaling depends on the funnel, the vertical, etc. And you do need to know the RCTs to know what scaling you use. Okay, so just to kind of wrap this up for you, can we do this even better? Yeah, we can. So instead of just having one calibration factor, what we can do is we can start using a much more complicated model where we calibrate, where we put lots of different last click windows in there. And we put in even more factors, like we put in features that we measure before campaigns, like budget, audience targeting information, elements of the creative. And then we put lots of features in that we measure after the campaign, like these last click metrics that we do, okay? And so there's a lot of flexibility. You can make these models very complicated. You can use very complicated forms like a deep neural net or things like that. And what's really fun here is that the data required to train and run the model is all aggregate. So once you run the RCTs and outcomes and compute the metrics, they're very easy to store for the future because you don't need to keep the individual level data around. So we do this. We do like an evaluation by leaving one out and seeing how well we predict. And let me show you what the results are. So again, 2,200 RCTs. And what we do is we train the model, but we don't train it on one RCT, and then we predict for that RCT. We see how well we do. That's the idea. Okay, so what we basically found is this. We have 3 models, just the raw last click metric. a calibration factor, which is this initial model I showed you with CF times, and then our actual sophisticated pi model. And what you notice here is that if you use a 1 hour window with no adjustments, you would be off by about 130%. To some extent, that's amazing, right? You would think it's even worse. And then if you use a calibration factor, it gets quite a bit better. That's what we talked to you about. And what we then do is we use the pi model and we get an error that's only a relative error that's only 68%. So this may still seem like a lot, but for advertising measurement, this is actually really, really good. Let me give you just an idea of how this compares to other models. The super sophisticated models we tried in our earlier work gave us errors of 491% and 2,904%. And if you just use the 7-day last click metric, you get an error of 167%. So huge improvements and so on. So what is useful here? Well, we think this is, you might ask, is this useful for practice? And the answer is we really think so, because attribution models are biased. Models that use these observational methods that we talked to you about trying to equalize the exposed and unexposed people, don't work. RCTs are really the viable option, but they're not feasible by scale. And the whole trick about pi, our approach, is that it makes RCTs scalable and therefore allows you to much better in ad measurement. So that's the idea. And again, if you like this kind of work, if you have some cool data set you would like us to use, if you would like to contribute with your expertise or resources, we would love to hear from you. Here's my email address and that of David Sack, and we're really excited to open for Q&A. Michaela, let's go.
Yes, we have a number of questions coming in, so I'll start with the first one. Does the collaboration factor vary by industry and cost of item purchased, or is it more affected by the attribution window?
The calibration factor varies with both. So it varies tremendously by the attribution window and the funnel, but it also varies a lot by the vertical. So there is a paper that I can share with you guys where you can actually read this. We have a research result that you can look at on my website. So if you just go to my site and you look it up, you will see that there's a paper that contains a graph in the back where you can actually see how this window varies by the calibration factor varies by vertical. In fact, I'm just putting in, let's see, the webinar chat. Is that something I can send to everybody? Yes, everyone. So I'm going to, this is a link to the paper that summarizes the research. And in the back of that, look at your chat. You can see the calibration factor.
Perfect. We did have another question similar to the calibration factor. Example uses last click as part of the calculation. Is there any way to do it without the last click data?
Yes. You don't need last click data. Basically, the whole idea is this idea that we are so the whole idea of this is that essentially the idea of the pi model is that we have as the thing we're trying to predict a RCT causal effect, right? An incrementality number. And then the thing that we're using to predict, we have things you would observe if you hadn't run an experiment. So things like last click, but it could also literally just be number of views. It could be how many detail pages you looked at. It could be anything else that you can drag out of your raw web logs when people who have been exposed to these ads. And you can literally feed that into a model and just see, as long as any of those things are correlated with incrementality, the approach is going to work. So it's actually super flexible. It doesn't have to be last click. Let's see, what else do we have? Go ahead, sorry.
No, you're good. Shifting gears just a little bit, do you see value in input from publishers that largely monetize their ad inventory via programmatic advertising?
I would love a clarification maybe to this question about what we mean with input. So if you could just tell me what you mean with input from publishers, I would love to answer that question again.
Yeah, we'll see if we'll get
Yeah.
another answer, but I'll follow up with
Yeah.
another one. Do
We,
you have access to data sets with unlimited look back windows, or is it constrained by publishers?
Oh, good question. So we have done our initial work, right? This work was done with Meta. And so as a result of that, we did have the full collaboration of the company. So we could actually we could look back however long we wanted, as long as it gets logged. In practice, you might not have incredibly long lookup windows. But right, a lot of the publishers at the moment have these sort of data clean rooms where you can use some of the more, so for example, at Amazon, we have this thing called the Amazon Marketing Cloud. Others have their own solutions, and they're basically these clean rooms where you can use your own data and some of the data from the advertising provider in order to try to create custom features. Michaela, do you mind if I just also quickly
Oh,
run through some of these and
yeah,
see
of
whether
course.
there's yeah, okay. Um, all right. Let me just see. Yeah, so a great question from Alex Keisner. It says, as the privacy and regulatory landscape changes leading to less available identity data, are you doing any research into how to continue to do RCTs? Yes. The answer is we are. So we have a research stream going on about how we can use geo experiments, which are likely to be able to retain their value in order to be able to calibrate with geo experiments. The biggest problem with that is that just the required sample sizes are going to go up. So it's not as good, but I think we'll still be able to do these things. Let me see. David Douglas says, are you applying similar model thinking about multi-attribution? And the answer is yes. We also have a work stream where we're thinking about how you could build a system of multi-touch attribution that would contain some of these ideas. Let me see. Daryl Ellis says, what is presented is rather interesting. However, it seems to me that this is primarily focused on consumer marketing and purchasing. Any work done for the application to industrial commercial marketing? So, Daryl, I would love to know what you mean with mostly consumer marketing. So I think the truth is that in consumer marketing, so I don't think there's anything specific that we're doing that's related to consumer marketing, but it is true, of course, that advertising measurement generally is much easier in consumer marketing than it is in industrial commercial marketing, simply due to the sheer available sample sizes of how many people have been exposed to ads, how many have actually purchased, et cetera. So you're totally right. This is not a model that I think we could use in order to, for example, see what is the effect of, say, spending on a trade show on whether we manage to negotiate better deals with industrial companies. So that wouldn't work. But I do think that it does apply to general situations in which you have something that looks like an ad exposure, where there's a ground truth out there because you've run an experiment, and then some metric of how people behaved. And it doesn't necessarily have to be end customers. That would be correlated with that exposure. So the idea is quite general, but you may run out of data for settings that are too industrial. Okay, let's see what else do we have. Set of conversions. Yeah, great question. So Raghu says, should we measure engagement and positive recall that will be more reliable instead of conversions? So I think of, right, there is a sense in which if you think about recall in particular, or a lot of brand work, it's typically very difficult to see the effect of brand advertising within the context of clicks and views and things like that, which is why a lot of people already basically rely on what they call brand lift studies in the first place, right? And if you're already relying on a brand lift study, you've essentially run the equivalent of something that looks very much like an RCT. So I think these methods are pretty generally applicable. I don't really care what the conversion outcome is. It could be a purchase, it could be an add to cart, it could be a view of a page. It's really just about what's the causal of, what are you interested in measuring the causal effect of? Could be a purchase, but it could also just showing up on a page. The approach is going to work for a variety of different outcome metrics. Cool. An existing Kellogg advertising WhatsApp. That's a great idea, Michaela. We should write that down. That'd be really fun. I don't think we have that. So it would be sort of right. I'm personally not a huge fan of sort of completely open social media. So this would be more of a sort of a Kellogg advertising smaller group with alum and faculty. I really like that idea, Tracy. Thank you for the suggestion. I think we should totally look up to that. Okay, let's see, what else do we have? Research ad platform overlap. Google, Meta both claiming, yeah, the answer is I don't think anybody does. So I think this is from Ye Jin, a question on research ad platform overlap. I think there's very bad evidence on that, not that I'm aware of. Audience segmentation data. No, we haven't worked on audience segmentation data as an identity issue. That could be interesting, David. David S said that. Reach out to me. Maybe there's something interesting we could do there. Do you have thoughts on publisher running incremental experiment versus third party? The publisher experiments typically, so it's quite difficult for third parties to run experiments unless they're geo experiments. Unless the publisher enables some experimentation platform. So Meta, for example, has an experimentation platform that you can use as an advertiser. But in principle, it should work with either. And we have seen pretty good results with a rather smaller number of experiments, although, of course, you get even better results if you can run a lot of them. So in principle, you would say that a publisher maybe has a leg up in trying to implement models like this, but third parties should be able to use the approach as well. Okay, can we include organic digital variables? Absolutely, yes, totally. We could, as long as I said, we're super agnostic as to what you put in, right? This is a very machine learning prediction method here. So what we're trying to do is anything that's correlated with telling me whether they're incremental conversions, I'm happy to use. That's the idea. And so to the degree that, say, an ad leads to more social media mentions, and those social media mentions become a signal of the incremental effect of the ad, then 100% you could put those in as well, which would be actually a great idea to do. Marco Lopez says, is there a way to apply RCTs to a sponsorship event activation? Yeah. So, well, yes and no. So, Marco, there are definitely ways how to try to measure a sponsorship event application, but an RCT probably isn't the right way to do it. So there I would point you towards methods like what we call difference in differences, where you might have a group gets its activated, a group that looks similar but didn't get activated, and you look at the difference pre-post of the two groups. So where you say the people who went through the sponsorship event, they showed a change in outcome, but the people who didn't go through the sponsorship didn't show a change in outcome. That method is going to work a little bit better than an RCT, which often relies on a very large sample size. David, that's a cool thing. We should talk to you. Get in touch with me, and I'll connect you to our faculty member Artem Timoshenko, who is the one who is thinking of using Gen AI for all sorts of purposes, which is a cool thing. All right, let's see. Vivian, I'm doing a good job here, Michaela, about running the list down. Are there examples of how brands are actioning on this improve prediction? So to my estimation, there is nobody out there who's currently using this approach in production. So as a result of that, I don't know. Good question. And brand what studies? I'm not quite sure what Martha means. And so let me lose. The last one we have is from Kay Kring. Do you use customer total journey modeling when looking at the data? I am not familiar with total journey modeling or what exactly you mean with that. I think there may be different things you have in mind that I may or may not know, but I don't know the term. So if I would love to answer if you repose the question or reach out to me, and I'm happy to engage with you on that. I made it. 3 minutes to go.
3 minutes to go. Well, thank you so much, Florian, for joining us today and for participating in This is Kellogg. It was a very interesting discussion, and everyone for asking questions. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Hold on. Paul asked one more
Oh,
question that I can
go ahead.
answer since I
Yes.
have a few more minutes.
Yes.
Where do you see the cumulative impact of ads? My question, Paul, is what do you mean with where? Do you mean whether we have run any studies where we look at sort of multiple ad exposures in terms of impact? Good question. So I don't know how to answer that question. I think it's a little bit too general for me. There's definitely work that shows that multiple ad exposures work, but I am not aware of anything that says these are kind of the verticals or the products or something like that where multiple ad exposures are more important than others. So good question, Paul. I don't know quite how to answer that. If that's something you're interested in and you think you know of a data set where we can look at that, reach out. We would be very interested in looking at that as well. Daniel, do we account for macroeconomic factors? So the beauty is we actually don't have to account for macroeconomic factors, although we can potentially, because you remember that all of our studies actually run as RCTs that we use to calibrate these models. And what that means is that all we're really trying to do is we are trying to typically treatment and control groups are both affected by whatever happens macroeconomic. But in principle, we could include macroeconomic factors as well as a predictor into our models. As a practitioner, okay, Luke, the first thing you should do is this. The first step you should do is you should try to run one RCT with a platform like Meta or something like that, or Google or anybody or Amazon. And what you should then do is to see what the RCT result is. And then you should compare it to the last click result that you get for that ad. And once you have done that, you should derive a calibration factor. That's your first start. And see just how far off it is. You know, maybe it's 0.9, and then you're like, last click is good enough. Maybe it's 0.05, and then you're like, whoa, I'm actually overestimating. Or maybe it's 1.5, and you're saying I'm actually getting more value out of my my last click measurement than I thought. So that would be for me the first step. And then it's a matter of sort of slowly stepping it up and running a few more experiments and seeing whether you can improve your estimate. That's what I would do if you don't have a direct contact with potentially other firms where you guys could share data or things like that. How often do you expect the model will need to be retrained? You know, in my experience, good question. I think it depends on how seasonal your general business is, but I would probably say that, I don't know, once a quarter. That's sort of how I think about it, probably in order to catch some of the seasonal variation that may exist, but something like that. And ideally, of course, more frequently if you have an ongoing set of RCTs that you can run. Okay, now I've gone over. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Nice chatting with all of you. Take care, and thank you for the great questions. I could tell there are a lot of Kellogg caliber people in this audience. I'm not sure I would have gotten these questions from many other business school audiences. So it's great to talk to all of you. And please reach out if you would like to be involved. We would love to see whether we can partner up with you.